Hello, everybody, and welcome to a panel discussion on open source. My name is Jay, president of the MLH Fellowship. It is great of you to join us. We'll be getting started in just a moment to allow for some others to join. In the meantime, for those that are here, I would love if you could share your location and where you're tuning in from. All right, Algeria, India. Got a few more joining so far. And we have all of our panel guests. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Jay, again, head of the fellowship. Joining me today is, coming up on screen, Matt, Alex, Katarina, and Chase. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, or allow them to introduce themselves, and then talk a bit about what the agenda is today. So in order of people on my screen, Alex, would you be so kind?
Sure. My name is Alex Scammon, and I am the head of open source software at G Research.
Excellent. And Matt, over to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt. I work on the AWS Amplify team. It's an open source framework, so excited to be here.
Katarina, over to you.
My name is Katarina Rindi. I am the Director of Community and Developer Relations for G Research open source team. I work with Alex.
And finally, Chase.
Hey everybody, I'm Chase Barker, Developer Relations Lead at Solana Labs. Really focused on just growing the developer community, promoting open source, and building out and scaling education.
Awesome. And just to give everybody some context on what each of your firms do, I think, some maybe more households, cognizant than others. But Chase, what does Solana Labs do?
So just a couple things. So Solana is a blockchain. Solana Labs is essentially an open source development shop that focuses on building out the core protocol. And I'm kind of here to support that effort. And outside of Solana Labs, there's an entire ecosystem of projects, probably in the thousands, that are building on top of it, that are all also quite open source. So we're big advocates for it.
And how about G Research? I guess Alex or Katarina, who's ever.
Yeah. So G Research is a quantitative research firm, which means that we take in data and try and predict movements in the market. And Katarina and I, run an open source program office for G Research, which means we have a number, 20, 30 intrepid open source engineers. And we're more or less deputized to wander around the technosphere, specifically around data science and machine learning tools and infrastructure tools, Kubernetes and OpenStack related chunks and security pieces, and improve those things largely. We go out and we make things better in the world so that G Research has better software internally. That's our role in the world. It's more or less a philanthropic mission from our point of view, to make software better.
And Matt, I think AWS as a whole is probably, a
Yeah.
household name. It seems
Yeah.
silly to ask, but if you can.
Yeah, no, I think like most folks know about AWS. I think to talk a little bit about Amplify. So it's an open source framework that allows developers to use AWS more easily. So it's really focused on front end developers. You can easily add things like authentication and storage, and you can host your apps. And all of our libraries are open source on GitHub. So I think it's pretty cool because I think when folks think about AWS, they don't necessarily see all the open source aspects, but we're on GitHub, we have a Discord, we have our own doc site. So in many ways, I think we're kind of pushing the barrier on open source at AWS, which is pretty cool.
And Matt, what do you do at AWS in particular?
Yeah, I think Chase said it really well. I think, he is focused on kind of building the open source program at Solana Labs. And I think, I'm doing something very similar on Amplify. So we're trying to build a program for developers to contribute to Amplify. We've built a contributing site. We've also are working internally with our teams to prioritize things like pull requests from the community. How are we going to reward a contributor? So really all things open source. And, I've been working with the fellowship since I think it started. So it's definitely been excited to kind of get students involved as well.
And Katarina, can you talk about what you and Alex do at G Research in particular?
Yeah, it's a mix of things. We have several projects, 2 projects right now that were built inside of G Research and that we are open sourcing. So we're taking them out into the public. That's a really interesting process. And then we have a handful of projects that we have taken over maintenance for that had gotten a little unhealthy or hadn't been updated for quite a while. And so we recognized that that would be a place that we could contribute. So we've got about, I think, 3 or 4 projects that we now maintain. And then we've got, 25 or more that we contribute to significantly with our developers. So it's sort of a variety of things that we're doing. And our mandate right now is to grow public contributions to these projects, and then for some of the internal ones, have other people, use that software and those projects as well, a little bit more than currently is happening.
And Chase, I would imagine, you and Katarina share similar titles, right? Like, how does that compare with what you're doing at Solana Labs?
Yes, so like lots of similar things. I think everybody in the open source world is trying to kind of make it clear that open source doesn't just mean you can use this code. It actually means that you can dig through it and contribute to it. So part of my job is making sure that I'm interacting with the developer community. We created something to build on Solana called the Solana Cookbook, which was really amazing because we built this framework for contributing not actually code, but it was actually it's like a reference tool for like code snippets and information how to build on Solana. So we built this framework and this project board, and then we told everybody about it, and all of a sudden these contributions start flowing in. So we basically built this sort of encyclopedia for Solana, and it was 100% community sourced. So it turned out to be a really awesome initiative, and those are the sorts of things I would say that Katarina probably knows that developer relations and all these things are very kind of organic and fluid, and you kind of just experiment around and see what works, and you kind of dive into what does and then kind of drop what doesn't. So yeah, it's a lot of things, but making sure that the world knows about the open source code and how they can participate is super important.
Can you talk about like the current state of, your open source community right now? Like obviously crypto is in this really, really interesting state. Like how does the current state compare there and maybe what you've seen at other places before this?
I mean, the current state is that so even our core engineers work out of Discord in public. They refuse to use Slack. They want everybody to know what they're building, and you see all these conversations in real time. We're pretty global, so it's based around the world. There is some interesting conversations. Not everybody in the Solana ecosystem is open source. Likely keeping their secret sauce secret until they have some sort of competitive advantage. That's for another day. But it's interesting. I get both sides of that. But the goal is to get to 100% open source across the board, because the biggest piece of this that I've seen is open source means innovation happens faster. So you share the knowledge, people see it, maybe they contribute to it, maybe they don't like it, they fork it, and then they build on top of it. And these are just really, really important things if we want to start moving faster.
I mean, Alex, that's a pretty interesting, comparison, right? With a firm that's really focused on quantitative finance and research. How does that compare with how your open source community is set up and what you see?
Yeah, I mean, it's I just say the biggest parallel is that all 3 of these organizations have recognized at whatever level they're at that they need a separate organization who is focused on open source engagement, which I feel is something that is new to the last 10 years or so, that more and more companies are awakening to the fact that this is actually a necessary thing. And it's interesting that a company like G Research is in that place, where G Research has historically been a very, very private and secretive company. It's a complete 180 from that mindset and mantra. All of a sudden, we're out there talking about what we're doing publicly. We certainly have plenty of secrets off hidden behind the scenes in G Research, but there's a recognition that a huge amount of our infrastructure is already open source tools, and that we need to improve them. And if we need to improve them, let's improve them in the public sphere so that everyone benefits and we don't have to have an internal fork. And this is the right way to do things. And that a company like G Research can put a significant amount of money towards doing things for free, philanthropically, out there in the universe. I'd say it's just a really wonderful trend from our point of view. So,
and Matt, I mean, we've talked a bit about, you know, Amazon being around for as long as it has, right? And some of like older technology and trends and systems and all that kind of thing. How does open source work at a place like AWS?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't think it's a secret. I definitely think it can be challenging at times. I think, you know, teams are used to kind of just building and, you know, working towards goals for reInvent. And I think we definitely want to change that and try to like have a roadmap that's in public. And, you know, we do have a Discord. I think it's really cool that Chase is saying that their engineers all kind of build in there and they use that instead of Slack. You know, that's probably something that would take us a little bit longer to get to, but we definitely have things like an office hours that's every single Thursday, and people from the community can kind of come in and bring their pull requests, and we have engineers. So I think we're kind of still trying to get 100% there. But, you know, I think we're just kind of showing our leadership that, hey, like we are mostly able to hire like in Seattle or in the United States, but now with open source, like we have contributors from all over the world. Our thought leadership is like way more than it ever has been because we can just reach so many more people. So I think just showing the benefits of open source is kind of allowing folks to kind of have an open mind and let us, you know, like try different things. So I think we're getting there. It just is a lot slower than a place like, yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about some of the challenge, like how are the open source projects really maintained at Amazon, and what are some of the challenges that you're having?
Yeah, so there is, you know, a central open source org, and you know, frankly, there's a ton of open source projects across Amazon. I'm not even aware of all of them. You know, for us, we have sort of our product teams that sort of build our features, and each team maintains their own library. So we have like an iOS library, a Flutter library, Android library, for example, and they each have their own engineering team. And then my team is essentially working across all of those repos to ensure that, hey, we're communicating with all our pull requests, we're communicating with all the issues. We have engineers called developer support engineers who are going in and trying to reproduce those issues. So we definitely kind of have the right mechanisms, I think, to help those engineering teams that might not necessarily always think about open source to think about open source, if that makes sense.
I'd say just one thought that I have on that. There's a slight difference between how we have to interact with open source and I think maybe Solana and AWS, where I know, Katerina, you mentioned a couple of our products that we've tried moving out from inside to outside, but primarily we're trying to help other people's projects. And I know there's a common refrain in the open source world where people are trying to open source their product so that they gain adoption and then they can build a company around it. But that's not what we do, which is, so it's worth pointing this out. I'd also like to hear your view, Katerina, on I think a thing that makes open source engineering interesting is the community aspect of it, and that not every engineer is necessarily good at it. They may be in a Discord channel, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're good at it. And to that end, we built this team And we realized, Katarina and I, that we weren't getting out there and building the communities as much as we had expected to, and that we really needed to focus on that. And so Katarina has been developing a whole arm of our organization specifically devoted to how to work with people, not just code. So I don't know.
There's a story that we tell, which is one of our developers who had a project that was a little bit niche, but it was used quite a bit, and he was burning out basically because it was just him, and he had plenty of people coming in and talking about his code and talking about things that they saw that were a problem, and it felt like a tax. And so he was really frustrated and was thinking about quitting. And we talked to him and said, every time someone comes in, looks at your code, comments on a PR, suggests features, those are people that are users, and those are people that are your community and that could actually be contributing. And so rather than getting defensive, which was generally what he would do, would get defensive and say, it's just me, I can't do everything. We said, turn it around and say, to everyone who comes in and criticizes, say, thank you. Thank you for looking at the code. Thank you for your suggestion. How would you fix this? Or would you like to contribute? And the turnaround was amazing. I mean, it was within a few months, we saw suddenly he had all of these other people that were working on his project. And now he refers to one of his contributors that was so consistent, he calls him his Robin to him as a Batman, right? He's got like a second in command, and that is in 6 months, less than a year. So it's really part of the people communication. He's got office hours now that he does every week. He's got this whole group of folks that were already watching the project, that were already using it and had comments. So yeah, there's a really human people component to that. And that's really individual. That's, one-on-one talking to people. It's talking about how they do their presentations. It's, Alex sending recommendations for buying a microphone so that when you do your presentation at on this online video thing, people can actually hear you. And so there's this whole other component about it that is it's about what the community needs, what those specific developers need, who's presenting, who's how they're doing it. And it's not just contributing code.
I got something to add to that, because I would probably say I spend, as developer relations, a lot of people are like, what in the world is that job? So I was an engineer for 12 years. So kind of have an advantage to an extent of knowing how to speak with developers. In Web3, it's a little bit different. We all live on Twitter. And this is where, and there's a lot of buzz. So it kind of gives me an advantage here because people are wanting to find out. So what I found out is I get very loud and make sure that people understand that they can reach out to me, and my DMs are always open. So they start reaching out. If they write a piece of content or tutorial, I'll share it. And it just kind of became this self-fulfilling, it just became this kind of circular thing where they're like, oh, I want to see my stuff shared. And then we created something called SoulDev, which is a content aggregator where we will basically, when people do really cool things, they need to know that that's appreciated. So I do my best job to make sure that's shared so others can see it, so it gets visibility and doesn't just die on Twitter and within 1 minute. So community is super important. Making sure that people feel a part of something bigger than themselves is super important. And I did see a message on here that somebody's asking how to contribute to open source. And the answer is to go to GitHub, look at an open source repo. You might see an issue on there that somebody has filed, and then go and then just create a PR and fix it. I mean, that's a very simplified version of it, but it's all there. That's the point of open source. Everything's available to you. If you can look, you can dive into the code and say, hey, this doesn't look right, fix a typo. I see somebody mention anything. And then now all of a sudden you're an open source contributor.
And Jay, this might be jumping ahead to your next few questions, but one of the folks in the chat said that the code base is a little overwhelming. Some of the ways that we have had our MLH fellow contribute is to go through the quick start guide, try to do all the steps of the quick start guide, if you even have one. So a lot of these projects don't even have one. But if you do have one, go through it, try all the steps. Does it work? Where are the problems? Does it work on one operating system and not another operating system? Is there no quick start guide at all? These are really simple beginning things that really help make a project much more appealing and usable. But if we don't have a good process in there, then people get very frustrated and then they give up. So as a new contributor, trying each of those steps, beginning, going through it, or trying to create a document, that's super useful for all of these projects. Improving the documentation, making it sound better. Maybe English isn't the first language for the person who originally wrote it. Help make that a little more understandable. I mean, really sort of simple things like this, but they're huge. They make a big difference for making projects inviting and usable.
Can you talk a little bit, Katerina, about how we're working together, specifically the MLH Fellowship, and how it's helping the project you're overseeing relative to DevRel, and maybe Alex, we could talk a bit about Apache Ozone and some of the other projects we have queued up too.
Yeah, we have our fellow Dhanashree has been incredibly patient going through much of what I just described, trying to go through the quick start, which we did have for one of our projects, and figuring out all the ways in which it doesn't work. Troubleshooting, problem solving, connecting with developers, developers that are working on it, pulling in a few other people to get help. And she's written up, so she's improved that. She's also improved our website, which was a little bit separate, but in order to improve the website, which was hosted it's on our GitHub pages, the GH pages on there. It's one of the branches on there. So she had to do PRs in order to improve the website. So she went through and did that. She's been improving the documentation for the quick start and mostly just troubleshooting and trying to figure out when it works, when it doesn't work. She's written up a blog post, like an article on what the process has been and how to write good quick start guides, because she's been going through this. And the next thing that she's going to be doing is making a little demo video, sort of a screencast of showing her starting up the project, sort of launching it, all the different steps, and talking through it, so that any new users that come in and want to try and launch the project can also, at least avoid some of the pitfalls. She's been great and incredibly patient, because we didn't have very good documentation, and so this has been very, very useful for us.
And Alex, we have two other projects that we've been working on with G Research, right? Apache Ozone, and more of a DevOps work stream. Can you talk a bit about the work we're doing with you and with the fellows?
Yeah, I have more visibility into the Ozone project at the moment, but I do know that on the DevOps side of things, Seki has been working with the DevOps team to go and clean up all of our various repos. Generally looks like setting up various pieces of our CI/CD process for lots of little projects that we have running around. On the Ozone side of things, Ozone is Cloudera's hope for a better HDFS in the Hadoop universe, a file system that can do HDFS large files, but also do small files as well. And Christos has been working for the past 10 weeks, I think we're that far through in the cohort. And he is contributing meaningful code to that project, cleaning up and refactoring various chunks of code that have been on the docket for a while. And that I wouldn't even say these are beginning projects for people. Like, we are working with him and guiding him, mentoring him through real code refactoring that needed to happen, writing more unit tests on chunks of code that were not well tested before, and now because of his efforts, they are better, and making a meaningful impact in what I think will be a meaningful project.
And Matt, I think you're kind of like one of the founding members of the fellowship in a very real sense. Can you talk about how you work with our fellows and some of the evolution of the program and how it's helped you and your team?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite similar. For us, we essentially assign fellows to a specific library, which basically just maps to like a GitHub repo. And then I think Katerina said this, but essentially we'll have fellows go through any any issues that sort of look like something that's a good first issue. We'll kind of work with them to identify those. We'll also ask them to take a stab at kind of finding some issues, and then we'll build a project board. So I think that makes it really easy to organize, kind of like a backlog of issues. And then they'll start to work through them. And I think tackling some of those maybe getting started guide fixes, or some of those more simple tasks, just allow the fellows to get more comfortable with the code. Also, just sometimes it's a fellow's first time ever like making a PR or addressing feedback, so I think it also helps with some of those mechanisms. And then we try to pair each fellow like one-to-one with an engineer on our team. That way they get, I think, a lot of attention, and they ask questions in Discord, and we try to meet like once or twice a week, kind of have a stand up. It's worked really well. I mean, fellows, I think, can be all over the world. So, from time zone perspective, just having that check-in, having Discord, I think it's more async than, our sort of standard meetings, but it's been working well. Trying to think if I have any sort of tips. Yeah, I think they've learned a lot, and they've also just helped us by reproducing issues that any of our developers have faced. So I think it's more so than just like feature development. We've also just had them become really active members of the community. One fellow wrote a really interesting guide, sort of published it as a website, and that was a great piece of content that I think unblocked sort of way more developers than just kind of adding a new feature, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think things from features to documentation has just been awesome.
And Chase, we just announced this project and program with Solana Labs earlier this year, and we have 15 fellows currently going through. Can you talk about some of the things they're working on, and what you have in mind for the summer?
Yeah, sure. So just because of the different components and levels of a blockchain, there's a ton of things involved. So we actually have a couple fellows working on the core protocol, which is more the lower level stuff. But on top of that, one thing that I think it's important for a lot of people that might be intimidated by blockchain to understand is there's this side of the blockchain where you're actually writing programs that run on the blockchain, similar to a program on a computer. But on the other side of that, there's a lot of the more front end stuff where you're working with Java, like a JavaScript SDK. We call it web3.js. And with that, you're able to use that JavaScript code to talk to a blockchain program where you're reading or writing data to it. Very similar to talking to any sort of API that you might have used in the past. There's just these common misconceptions that people hear the blockchain and they kind of freak out and they're like, this sounds crazy. But we have very similar tool sets, and you can write to a blockchain in much the same way that you can write to a database. And like, that's probably an oversimplification, but I think it's important for fellows to know that blockchain is not quite as intimidating as you might think. But outside of that, we just built a new protocol on the client side called Solana Pay, where now merchants can actually generate QR codes, and you can scan it with your wallet and pay that immediately, which is a cool one. And then obviously most of you probably have heard of NFTs, and we do a lot of work in the NFT space, and there's lots of really fun stuff to do around that as well. And then there's obviously DeFi, which is decentralized finance. That's not for everybody, but it is a really cool sort of area if that's something you're interested in. But we have code repositories for just about everything you can think of, just from Web 2, but now it's on the blockchain. So,
I mean, a ton of messages in the comments about how to get started and what projects are good to start in and things like that. Without sounding, I don't know, what's the word, cynical or something like that, to be honest, a really good way of getting started in open source is MLH. I'm going to do just like a plug here for it, because it is incredibly intimidating. Some people have said, no, just go to GitHub and find some newbie issues. It's still intimidating. And you want to find a community who's nice and welcoming and will bring you in, but how do you know who those people are? And there's a chicken and the egg thing. You got to dip your toe in the water to even find out whether this community is even nice. And one thing that's been really lovely to see is our more senior engineers are able to mentor and help people through the process of just getting their toe in the water. Because once you're familiar with the process and familiar with some communities, you know where to go. And this doesn't stop at just the first level. Our experienced engineers ourselves have had the same experience. This will continue, don't worry. You will continue to be intimidated. But our best example of this is one of our most senior engineers was really trying to do something in the Spark project, Apache Spark, was never getting anywhere. In the meantime, he just happened to fix some things in the Horovod project, and they were wonderful to him, and they invited him to do more work, and he got really engaged in that process, and now he's on the technical steering committee of that whole entire project. And it's just, you find your people eventually. But to go back to my original thing, try MLH, because it really does help to have some people around you to get your first go at it.
I promise I didn't ask Alex to say that. That
Nope.
was
Nope.
literally as genuine as it gets. I recognize we're at time, Matt. It sounded like you had one more thought you wanted to get out there.
I was just gonna second that. I think not only do you get paired with all these exciting companies, but there's a lot of hackathons, a lot of mentorship sessions, a lot of just networking in the Discord. So I would definitely apply. Yeah, it's an awesome program. So we're definitely excited to keep working with MLH.
I'm going to go ahead and drop the link to the application one more time in the chat. We're 3 minutes over. I just want to thank each of you for your time so much. Those of you who are listening in, thank you for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Thursday. And yeah, I'll see you soon.
Bye, Thanks,
everybody.
Jay.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to meet
Bye,
everyone.
guys.
Likewise. Bye.